Starting off at number 10 is the SS Andrea Doria, also known as the Mount Everest of scuba diving, so you bet your ass I was going to start with this one. So the Doria was an Italian ocean liner which had the capacity of holding around 1,200 passengers and 500 crewmen. Italy was trying to rebuild their reputation after World War II, so the Doria was an icon of national pride. It was their biggest, fastest and safest vessel at the time, and it went on its maiden voyage in January of 1953. In July of 1956, its final voyage took place, and it was such a 1 in a million chance it sank the way it did. It went from place to place and was finally making its way from Naples to New York, but at that time the MS Stockholm was making its way from New York to Sweden. The Doria had been traveling in heavy fog for hours now, so they were going slow, they had their precautionary measures in place, it was all going well. When the MS Stockholm entered the fog, they sort of had no idea what was happening, nor could they see any ship in the fog. Now they knew they were both there because of the radar, but they miscommunicated each other's courses and started steering towards each other. They collided horribly and the ship sank 180 feet below the water. Thankfully, all the survivors were saved and only 46 died in the crash itself. Now divers that go down there have seen odd movements from the corner of their eye inside the shipwreck when there aren't any fish around. They felt the sensation of being touched on the shoulder and being pulled a certain direction despite no sudden current change. And I mean, not to mention, because it's so deep, so many divers died just trying to even reach the vessel.
In our number 9 spot today, we have the MV Dona Paz. This maritime disaster took place on December 20th, 1987, when this passenger ferry collided with the oil tanker, the MT Vector. The collision took place in the Tablas Strait, which is about 180 kilometers south of Manila. This ship was carrying more than 4,000 people, which was double its capacity, and at the time of the collision, there were no senior officers on the bridge of the ship, and on the Vector there was no lookout, and it is thought that both ships lacked a functioning radio. That's what I like to call all bad. The weather and the waters were both quite calm when the collision happened, and despite the clear visibility, neither ship gave an indication that it noticed the other. When the collision occurred, the 8,800 barrels of oil and gasoline on the Vector quickly ignited and engulfed both ships in flames. Out of the over 4,400 people that were on board both ships, only 26 people were rescued from the waters and survived. It really makes you wonder exactly what happened here, because from an outside perspective, it seems like this tragedy could have been avoided. In our number 8 spot today, we have the MV Wilhelm Gustloff. This ship was a part of the Nazi Strength Through Joy program, which was an important propaganda tool during the Third Reich. This ocean liner is said to have carried German workers who were indulging in leisurely activities on cruises throughout the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean, but when World War II began, it ended up being converted into a hospital ship. Closer to the end of the war, this ship then switched gears again and was called on in order to evacuate German troops and civilians from East Prussia ahead of the advancing of the Soviet troops. At this time, the ship had shed its white paint with red crosses that symbolized it as non-combatant, and this, coupled with the clear presence of troops on board, as well as the anti-aircraft guns on board, well, it was obvious that this made it a viable military target. While it was built to accommodate around 1,900 people, on January 30th, 1945, as the ship left port, an estimated 10,000 people packed on board. Just after 9:00 p.m. that night, a Soviet submarine fired 3 torpedoes at the ship, which slammed into its side. Because of ice, many of the lifeboats were inoperable, and those who were on board that were best trained to deal with these kinds of emergencies and dire situations had either been killed in the blast or were trapped below the deck. Just over an hour later, the ship slipped underwater. Unlike a lot of the other wrecks on this list, rescue did begin just minutes after the SOS call was sent out, but still only 1,200 people were saved. With a death toll of somewhere around an estimated 9,000 people, this remains one of the deadliest shipwrecks in history. In our number 7 spot today, we have the HMS Victory. This is one of the oldest wrecks we have on this list today, and this one took place on October 5th, 1744. The HMS Victory was a 100-gun Royal Navy vessel, and on October 3rd, just a couple days before the wreck, the ship was in a fleet reaching the English Channel. A storm ended up scattering the fleet all apart from each other, and on October 4th, the ships with the Victory lost sight of her. What happened to the HMS Victory remained a mystery for over 260 years, and it wasn't until 2009 that the fate was found out. Just 50 miles off the coast of England near Plymouth, the US company Odyssey Marine Exploration ended up finding the wreckage, and and when found, the ship's cannons were still in good condition, with even the royal crests visible underwater, despite the nearly 3 centuries it had been. This was also the first time that any trace of the 1,150 sailors that were on the ship were found, as sadly no one in the entire crew survived the wreck. In our number 6 spot today, we have the SS Kiangya. On December 4th, 1948, this ship was carrying thousands of passengers who were fleeing Shanghai due to the advancing People's Liberation Army. On this day, the official number of passengers was said to be 2,150, which was already almost double its capacity rate, but it said that several thousand more people crowded onto the ship before it left the docks. I mean, this makes a lot of sense. It's weighing the risk of packing onto this boat versus staying in the situation you're currently trying to flee. As the ship got to the mouth of the Huangpu River, it is believed that it may have struck some sort of World War II era mine or something like that because it just exploded. Rescuers were also unaware of the explosion for hours, which only made the situation worse. Somewhere around 700 passengers were rescued, but this meant that a number estimated to be from 2,750 to as many as 4,000 people lost their lives in this explosion and the subsequent sinking of the ship. In our number 5 spot today, we have the RMS Empress of Ireland. The Empress of Ireland was a Canadian ocean liner that was out to sea on May 29th, 1914, when tragedy struck. The ship was traveling down the St. Lawrence River through some thick fog, which is what led to her colliding with a Norwegian collier, which is a bulky cargo ship that was designed in order to transport coal. The cargo ship didn't sink, but unfortunately the same couldn't be said for the Empress, as she listed and fast. Water began pouring in through portholes, which led to those below deck meeting their fate rapidly. The official death toll of the crash is said to have been 1,012 people, and it still remains the worst disaster in Canadian maritime history. It makes me wonder how, as a Canadian especially, I've never heard of this accident before. The wreck of the ship still lies in a fairly shallow 130 feet of water, which has made it a pretty popular diving location for those wishing to retrieve relics. In our number 4 spot today, we have the SS General Slocum. This passenger steamboat was built in Brooklyn, New York, and on June 15, 1904, it was carrying members of the St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church as they were on their way to a church picnic. They were traveling up the East River on the way to Long Island Sound when a fire started in the lamp room. Considering the fact that the lamp room was obviously filled with lamp oil, while a fire on board a ship is never good, this is one of the worst case scenarios. Actually, lamp oil, oil rags, and nearby paint locker in a cabin filled with gasoline are actually what created this worst case scenario. The safety equipment of this ship was not nearly up to standards, as it was rarely even checked, and when the crew attempted to get the fire hose in order to put out the flames, they found a rotten fire hose that crumbled in their hands. The life jackets being given out to people began to fall apart, and they couldn't even access the lifeboats at all. I cannot even imagine the panic people were feeling at this point. Many of the passengers saw no other option and jumped into the water to try and swim, but like many Americans at the time, they didn't know how, and the heavy wool clothes they wore only worked to weigh them down. At the end of the day, it is said that around 1,021 people lost their lives in this absolutely tragic event. In our number 3 spot today, we have the MV La Julia. This was a ship that was owned by the Senegalese government, and despite the fact that it was designed to carry a maximum of 580 passengers, on September 26, 2002, the ship had at least 2,000 people on board. This is obviously a huge issue, and this, coupled with the fact that there was a large amount of people who were sleeping on the ship's deck, which is of course above the center of buoyancy, only made matters worse. The ship was en route to the Senegalese capital of Dakar, and as it sailed farther out to sea than it was licensed to sail, it ended up encountering a storm and really rough waters. The ship ended up capsizing, and out of the 2,000 people on board, only 64 people survived the entire ordeal. Not only was this because of the fact that the ship sank exceptionally quickly, but it's mostly because rescue was not sent out until several hours after. The wreck is thought to be one of the worst non-military disasters in all of maritime history. Despite the severity of the situation, no one has been charged or prosecuted for the disaster to this day. In our number 2 spot today, we have the MS AlSalam Bokaccio 98. This is a shipwreck that took place on the Red Sea on February 3rd, 2006. At the time of the wreck, the ship was en route from Dubai, UAE, on the way to Safaga in southern Egypt. When the ship left port, it was already listing due to poor weather, and things only got worse from here. A fire broke out in the engine room, and it continued to burn despite the crew's best efforts to get it put out. The crew used buckets and buckets of seawater, and at one point the fire was temporarily put out, but it reignited before long. At this point, the captain tried to turn around and return to the port, but the drainage pumps weren't working properly, which meant that the hull of the ship had now filled up with water. When they tried to turn, it just resulted in the balance being all thrown off and the ship capsized. Like I mentioned before, when they set out, the weather was already bad, which of course made the rescue efforts substantially more difficult because those people also had to try and sail through this bad weather and strong winds. This left dozens out floating in the Red Sea. Sadly, it is reported that somewhere around 1,018 people lost their lives in this wreck. In our number 1 spot today, we have the MV Goya. This ship was built in Norway in 1940 and was meant to be a freighter, but in a World War II world, this ship ended up being used as a passenger ship in order to evacuate citizens as a part of Operation Hannibal. This, of course, as anyone could reasonably imagine, meant that the ship was very often overcrowded as they were trying to rescue as many people as possible at a time. On April 16th, 1945, the ship was carrying over 7,000 passengers, which is 5 times the amount of people it could safely carry, when it was hit by a torpedo that was sent from a Soviet submarine just before midnight. The force of the explosion was so great that the ship only took minutes to sink, and since the timing of the incident had most passengers in their beds, you can imagine the outcome. Because of a lack of proper record keeping in with the absolute panic of trying to rescue people with the imminent threat of attack, it isn't quite clear exactly how many people lost their lives in this wreck, but it's thought that somewhere between 6,000 to 7,000 passed away, which is unbelievable. It is thought that there were around 180 survivors of the wreck, and due to the unbelievable tragedy, the location of it has now been officially declared a war grave by the Polish authorities. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Mont Blanc and Emo. Halifax is a port city that is located here in Canada in the province of Nova Scotia. Halifax was a super important place during the First World War as it acted as a hotspot for ships that were carrying supplies, troops, ammunition, war stuff. On December 6th, 1917, a Norwegian ship called Emo left Halifax and it ended up colliding with a French ship called the Mont Blanc. This is already disastrous, but it was made significantly worse by the fact that the Mont Blanc held explosives. Because of the collision, the Mont Blanc was pushed towards the shore and ended up setting the harborfront ablaze. Just a few minutes later, the entire ship exploded with a blast so strong that windows 50 miles away were shattered. Unfortunately, there were many people at the waterfront when the explosion happened, which led to 1,800 people dying in this accident. 9,000 people were injured, and it is said that 1,600 homes were destroyed in the blast. The force of this blast really cannot be understated. It was so powerful that it caused a tidal wave and violent tremors, which were able to uproot trees from out of the ground. They damaged railroad tracks, and they destroyed numerous buildings whose debris was scattered for hundreds of yards. In the end, this is what made this explosion one of the most violent non-nuclear explosions in history, and what makes it likely the world's largest accidental man-made explosion.
Coming in at number 9 is the SS Muigan, and it's Irish, so I hope I said that right. Shout out to Jack Finch. So this vessel only survived till her second voyage before sinking off the coast of the Lizard Peninsula near Cornwall. It was October 1898, and the ship was making its way from London to New York when it suspiciously veered wildly off course and went towards the Cornish coastline. It crashed into the highly dangerous rocks of the Manacles, killing 106 people in the process. But the most sus part of it all was that one rescuer on the job claimed he saw a mystery man leaving the ship on a lifeboat and making his way inland, and that mystery person turned out to be the captain of the ship. Biggest snake of 1898 confirmed. It was speculated that there was just no way such an experienced captain would veer that much off course and crash on rocks that were nowhere near his planned route. Apparently, he had purposefully sunk the vessel for insurance gain, and if that's true, I hope killing 106 people was worth it, you effing snake. Divers that go explore the spooky relic have reported feeling a very weird sensation when touching the steamer, almost like an electric shock or current going through their system. One group of divers even said they were guided by something or some presence or something to a skeleton that was hidden inside the ship. At number 8 we have the RMS Road. Now this one is royally screwed. It was a UK Royal Mail ship before it sank, and it's now one of the most popular Caribbean wreck dive sites that people explore. On the day it sank, the San Narciso hurricane hit, so the master of the ship decided to move everyone off his ship called the Conway, which was to stay at the harbour, and onto the Rhone, which was to go into the open water. As the Rhone was going, the tail end of the storm hit them. The passengers were tied to their bunks to prevent injuries, which became problematic later on, as you can imagine. Captain Woolley was thrown straight overboard and never seen again. The anchor was cut off and still remains wrapped around the same coral head a century and a half later. 145 people were aboard and only 25 survived. Despite a horrible sinkage, the dive site is actually quite safe and roomy and kind of pretty. Like, the hull is filled with marine life and coral, so it's not super creepy. However, divers who have gone down there have heard screams underwater, I'm assuming from the people that were tied up and unable to escape as the ship was sinking right under them. Anxiety? Divers also feel like they're being touched by things that aren't there, and I mean, you can attribute that to water currents and whatnot, but if you're hearing screams, ghosts are definitely around, my friend. Filling our number 7 slot are Fujikawa Maru and Hoki Maru, because the only thing better than one haunted shipwreck is 2. These 2 ships were part of a 60 vessel unit that was basically Japan's stronghold in that part of the Pacific Ocean. They were sunk by US forces in 1944 during World War II, and now both wrecks are at the bottom of Truk Galoon. There's just something really eerie about what water damage and decay looks like, and I feel like everything is just a lot creepier underwater anyway. But either way, divers that have the balls to go down there and explore the wreck have 2 things to worry about: sharks and the fact there's still life on the shipwrecks. Which one is scarier? You tell me. I vote number 1. Now, divers have reported hearing the sound of machinery working away, and when the show Destination Truth was down there filming the wreckages, they picked up recordings of engines turning over and working when, hello, that is not possible. Now at number 6 is the USS Liberty. So this vessel was a US Army cargo ship that got torpedoed by a Japanese submarine back in Jan of 1942 and obviously did not survive. It was towed and beached somewhere along the coast of Bali, and it stayed there until the eruption of Mount Agung in 1963. The eruption pushed the Liberty back out to sea, where it lays on a sand slope 100 feet underwater. Divers that go there have never reported seeing people down there or hearing sounds, but most of them have seen a rapidly approaching object that looks like it's coming at you and then it just disappears. Many believe it's the apparition of the torpedo that caused the vessel's downfall way back when. And this is cool to me, since I never really hear about people seeing the ghosts of inanimate objects. Like people and animals, yes, but a torpedo? That's the first for me. Coming in at number 5 is the SS Kamloops. So this one was actually a Canadian lake freighter that went on its first trip in 1924. In late November of 1927, it was carrying a bunch of cargo like paper-making machinery, shoes, piping, tar paper, etc. And it was going through Lake Superior, and sadly, in that period, storms were horrific. If you live in Canada, then I don't even need to tell you how bad the winter is, and in water, it's even worse. Now, covered in ice, the Kamloops was last seen going towards the shore of Isle Royale on December 6th. Search parties for the ship started a week after, but to no avail. The 22 people aboard were never seen again. Someone even found a message in a bottle a year later from Alice Bettridge, and she initially survived the sinking, and the note said, "I am the last one left alive. Freezing and starving to death on Isle Royale in Lake Superior. I just want mom and dad to know my fate." How haunting is that? Like, imagine being Alice, trying not to die, trying not to freeze, all alone just hoping for someone, like anyone. Now, the vessel wasn't located till 1977, when it was discovered 270 feet below water near Isle Royale. The whole thing was intact because of the ice-cold water, and there's even a conserved body of a sailor inside the wreckage till this day. Locals call him Whitey or Grandpa, and when divers go down there, they feel this happy aura around his body that they can't explain. Grandpa also has the habit of moving around on his own despite being jammed under debris. Some divers have claimed he's under a ladder, others say he's under a door. How does he randomly move under debris? Like, the water can't move him like that. How does he do that? Grandpa, tell me your secrets. At number 4 is the ETHEL shipwreck, and if you guys haven't heard of the YouTube channel Amy's Crypt, definitely check it out. She investigated the shipwreck at night, and I was genuinely just shitting myself watching it. And if you guys like scary things, there you go. Now, on the 2nd of January 1904, the ETHEL was on its way from South Africa when it hit a reef off the coast of South Australia. The wreck was not as big of a tragedy as you'd think. When it struck the reef, a young 19-year-old boy volunteered to swim to shore with a lifeline, but he was swept away and killed ASAP Rocky. Thankfully, by the next morning, the ETHEL drifted to shore and everyone was safe. Suspiciously enough, the vessel that reported the ETHEL's wreckage was called the Ferret, and that ship went down the same way in the exact location location the ETHEL did, but just 16 years later. Now there are 26 shipwrecks along the coast, and it looks like a ship graveyard because it is. There's just a bunch of ship skeletons, and yes, they actually look like skeletons, so I was like, wow. Amy went to the wreckage at night and used a device that transforms frequencies we can't hear into ones we can. She asked if there was someone around them that was aboard the ETHEL, and a clear hymn was heard on the device. Members of her crew felt like they were being touched by the spirits around them, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised judging by how many ships died there. Filling our number 3 slot is the SALEM Express. Now this was originally a French passenger ship that sank in the Red Sea. It was basically a roll-on, roll-off car and person ferry that operated between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Now on the 17th of December 1991, the vessel was on its way back from carrying hundreds of Egyptian pilgrims when it hit the Hindman Reefs. Now the ship was hit really badly. Its bow completely blew open and it was underwater within minutes. Around 470 people died, which was controversial since around 700 people were aboard the ship, and if that was the case, where did the rest of these people go? Like, where they at though? Now teams went to the wreckage to recover the bodies under there, but had to eventually stop since it was getting too dangerous to go into the wreckage since its openings were sealed with plates, and if you get stuck under there, you're screwed. Now the thing is like a frozen relic in time. There are still cars down there, luggage, TVs, children's toys and clothes. It's just eerie. It's located under 30 meters of water, and divers that have gone there have reported hearing children laughing and the sounds of car engines revving. Some have even claimed they've seen the tires of the cars move even though they've been jammed and rusted for decades. Now at number 2 is the St. Peter. Now this schooner was delivering a shipment of coal from New York to Ohio back in October of 1898. I feel like 1898 was a bad year for ships and stuff. Like I feel like I've seen that year pop up a lot in this video, so I'm like, not a good year for anyone. Either way, the St. Peter encountered a horrible storm on Lake Ontario, which again happened previously on this list as well. You can't underestimate Canadian winter, you guys. What are you doing? Big mistake. Anyway, the storm destroyed the vessel, and the crew actually survived for 12 hours after the wreck during 70-mile-per-hour winds and 20-foot waves. They're the real MVPs right there. My heart goes out to the unimaginable things they had to go through in those 12 hours. By the end of it, when rescues finally got there, there was only one survivor, and that was the boat's captain, who was clinging to the boat's mast. Apparently his wife Martha was clinging onto it too, but drowned mere minutes before her husband was rescued. It's said her spirit haunts the wreckage, and divers like to go around the October period because it said Martha's ghost is most likely to be seen around her death anniversary. No matter what time of the year divers go though, they always experience horrible conditions around the area of the boat. Said to be, I guess, the weather haunting the area, just like it did when it sank? Who knows? And finally, at number 1 is the SS Emperor. Always gotta save the best for last, you guys. Now the SS Emperor was a Canadian freighter that sank off the shore of Isle Royale in Lake Superior back in 1947. The Great Lakes are honestly just taking down everyone, like no mercy, and no one is safe. Hide your kids, hide your wife. Now on the 3rd of June 1947, the vessel left Thunder Bay with nearly 10.5 tons of iron ore. By midnight, the captain gave the ship to the first mate, who was extremely fatigued. That caused him to not realize the ship was going the wrong way, and by 4 AM the freighter crashed on Canoe Rocks near Isle Royale. The whole thing literally sank within 30 minutes, and 12 crewmen died, including the first mate and captain. Rescuers got there quickly and rescued everyone else aboard, but bodies are missing and have still yet to be found. The wreckage nowadays has a very sinister reputation. Apparently divers have seen the dead crew still working away at the ship with its ruined equipment. Instead of having eyes, they have dark pools of nothing and have been heard whispering the word die repeatedly. Nah, B? Nah. And that's it for today's video, guys. I don't know who in their right mind would want to go and explore a haunted shipwreck God knows how many feet underwater. I'm not trying to be that deep underwater. I'm not trying to get drowned.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have the SS Sultana. Starting off heavy with this list today, we have one of the worst maritime disasters in US history, and it occurred on April 27, 1865. The SS Sultana was a side-wheel steamship, and on that fateful day, it exploded on the Mississippi River just north of Memphis, Memphis, Tennessee. This incident took place in a time after the Civil War had just ended, and of course, the POWs held in Confederate military prisons were eager to get back to their homes after everything they had just endured. This led to the federal government paying a hefty price to steam operators for each soldier they took with them. This then led to a whole bunch of steam operators cutting corners so that they could bank on this deal. In the case of the Sultana, this meant safety things like repairing a leaky boiler or adhering to the capacity limits were cut. At the time of the explosion, the ship was carrying as many as 2,300 people, which was over 6 times the limited capacity. Unfortunately, the neglect of the boiler led to it rupturing, which initially took the lives of hundreds of those on board. After this, the already overloaded docks were made weaker and they ended up collapsing, which left people trapped. In the end, around 1,800 people lost their lives. While I'm sure there are many Americans and others from around the world who have heard of this tragic incident by now, at the time, not many people knew about it at all. If you remembered, this happened on April 27th, 1865, and President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th, 1865, which ended up overshadowing this tragic event in terms of coverage. And it's not like there was a 24-hour news cycle back then where they were just constantly being bombarded with the worst of the worst. Even today, where we do have that, terrible things get overlooked and overshadowed all of the time. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Toyamaru. This ship was a Japanese train ferry that was out to sea in between the islands of Hokkaido and Honshu in 1954 when it was struck by Typhoon Marie. The captain tried to ride it out and attempted to anchor the ship in place, but the winds were so strong that it broke free. Seawater began pouring into the engine compartment, which then caused the steam engine to quit running, and the ferry was then completely uncontrollable. The captain continued to try whatever he could to get the ship to safety, and he even tried to beach the ship, but unfortunately the waves were just too powerful. After being tossed around in the waves and battered by the water, and after all the rain and strong winds, the ship ended up capsizing and sinking. In the end, 1,163 people lost their lives in this disaster, including 35 American soldiers who were members of the US Army's 1st Cavalry Division Artillery. The Toyamaru wasn't the only ship sunk in this storm, as Typhoon Marie also sank 4 other ferries as well. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Taiping Steamer. In 1949, the Taiping Steamer was out to sea and was seriously overloaded with 1,000 war refugees on board. This ship was sailing from Shanghai, China to Keelung, Taiwan when it collided with a cargo vessel called the Qianyuan. At the time of this accident, the Taiping was fleeing the Chinese Civil War, which is why it was so overcrowded when it only should have been holding a maximum of 580 passengers. This kind of overcrowding did not help with the sinking of the ship and sadly only sped up the process. It is also said that the ship was steaming without lights even though it was after curfew, which of course likely didn't help to avoid this very tragic situation. Sadly, there were 1,500 people who lost their lives in this collision. In our number 7 spot today, we have the SS Principe Umbrato. This ship was built in 1909 as an Italian passenger ship, but in the times during the First World War, it ended up being converted into an armed merchant cruiser. On June 8, 1916, this ship was transporting troops on the Adriatic Sea. These troops were part of the 55th Infantry Regiment and were on their way back from Albania to Italy. Although the ship was accompanied by others, it still ended up being struck by an Austro-Hungarian U-5 submarine that had launched a torpedo attack. This ship ended up sinking just minutes later, and it is said that this disaster took the lives of 1,926 men, making it the worst naval disaster of the First World War in terms of lives lost. In our number 6 spot today, we have the Yamato. This ship was a Japanese battleship that served in the Second World War. She was the lead ship of her class of battleships, and she was one of the 2 of the heaviest and most powerfully armed battleships ever constructed. On April 7, 1945, the ship was about 300 kilometers south of the Japanese island of Kyushu when it was confronted by a US carrier-based aircraft. This aircraft bombed the ship, which led to it capsizing. This then caused the ammunition on board to explode, which tore the ship in 2. After a total of 13 torpedo hits and 8 hits, the ship completely sunk. The ship was accompanied by a light cruiser and 4 other destroyers, which were all sunk in this event as well. This sadly led to thousands of deaths, as most of the crew lost their lives in this battle. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Joseph Stalin. The Joseph Stalin was of course a Soviet passenger ship that was converted to carry troops during the Second World War. This ship was very important to Soviet forces as it was used in 1941 in the evacuation of Tallinn and was later used to evacuate the Soviet naval base in Hango, Finland. Just after this evacuation on December 3rd, 1941, the ship ended up entering the Gulf of Finland where it encountered 3 German mines. This led to the crew scrambling around to try and fix up the damage that the mines had caused. While they were distracted by this, Finnish forces ended up spotting the ship and saw an opportunity to strike. This led to the ammunition that was on board the Soviet ship to detonate, which ended up taking the lives of 3,849 out of the 5,589 who were on board. Those who didn't lose their lives in this incident ended up being captured and held as prisoners of war by the German forces. In our number 4 spot today, we have the SS Cap Arcona. This ship was a German luxury ocean liner that was launched in 1927. But by the time the mid-1940s rolled around, however, like many other ships on this list, this one was put to use to help in the country's war efforts. This time, this ship was converted into a prison ship. In April of 1945, with the advance of the British Army, prisoners being held at concentration camps were being loaded onto ships, and the Cap Arcona was one of them. On May 3rd, 1945, with more than 6,000 people on board, the ship was attacked by the British Air Force. The prisoners on board were being held below deck at the time, and the ship was not marked with any sort of red cross, so unfortunately those in the British Air Force did not realize that the ship was filled with prisoners at the time. The ship capsized but did not sink entirely, but still this wreck caused somewhere around 5,000 deaths. In our number 3 spot today, we have the HMS Armenia. This was a Soviet passenger ship that was first launched in November of 1928, and she had a maximum capacity of 980 passengers. During the Second World War, this ship was put to use by transporting troops, and from October 9th, 1941, the ship was used to evacuate soldiers, workers, and materials from Odessa. In November of 1941, there was the invasion of German troops that led to an extreme rush to evacuate the hospitals in the city of Sevastopol, and the Armenia was repurposed again into a hospital ship. This led to about 4,000 wounded people and medical personnel from 11 different hospitals being loaded onto the ship to set sail towards Yalta. Once there, another 1,000 passengers were loaded onto the ship in a rush, none of which were officially recorded. On November 7th, the ship was attacked by a German Heinkel HE-111, and in just 4 minutes the ship sadly sank, taking the lives of almost everyone on board. Just 8 people survived the entire ordeal. In German records, there is no mention that the Armenia was a hospital ship, so it's unclear if they omitted that tale or if they mistakenly believed that it was a troop carrier. Either way, it is absolutely devastating. In our number 2 spot today, we have the Arctic. This ship made its maiden transatlantic voyage in 1850, and it was best known for its speed. This ship was able to cross the Atlantic in just 9 days. On September 27, 1854, the ship was sailing from Liverpool to New York City when it collided with a French steamship called the Vesta. This occurred in the thick fog that was found just off of Cape Race, Newfoundland. At first it appeared as though the Vesta had received more damage in the collision, but soon the captain of the Arctic realized that the ship was rapidly taking on seawater. He decided to abandon the Vesta and head for land in order to save his passengers, but once he left the other ship, the damaged Arctic continued to take on water, which then put out the furnaces and caused engines to stop working. This is when the captain ordered that those who were the most vulnerable be placed into the lifeboats first, but instead a number of crew and male passengers dashed towards the lifeboats, leaving hundreds of people to go down with the ship. There were about 400 people on board the ship that day, and only 87 of them survived. 22 of the survivors were passengers, and the rest, crew. The captain went down with the ship, but he managed to stay alive by clinging to some wreckage until rescue came. The other ship, the Vesta, did not sink and ended up making it to St. John's, Newfoundland. The crew members who abandoned everyone else on the ship were criticized for their behavior, which violated the laws that forbid sailors to put their own safety before that of passengers in emergencies. Despite this, however, none of the men were prosecuted for their actions. In our number 1 spot today, we have the RMS Lencastria. This ship was a British ocean liner, but in April of 1940 she was reconstructed to be a troop ship under the command of Captain Rudolph Sharp. He sent the ship off to help aid in the evacuation of British troops and citizens from France, and on June 14, 1940, the ship departed from Liverpool. On June 16th, the ship anchored near the town of St. Nazaire, and the following day, somewhere between 4,000 and 9,000 refugees loaded on board. This included civilians, soldiers, and other military officials. While carrying all of these people, around 4 p.m. on June 17th, the German Junkers Ju-88 the ship, which caused it to capsize and sink in an extremely fast 20 minutes. This caused over 1,400 tons of fuel to leak into the water, some parts catching fire, and while there were 2,477 survivors, no one is quite sure how many people lost their lives. This is because it was obviously a hectic rescue mission that had people rushing aboard. No one is quite sure just how many people were on board before the attack happened. It is thought that somewhere from 4,000 to 6,500 people might have lost their lives during this, which is truly a terrifying number.